record. So thank you for joining us today on December 15th, 2021. This meeting is jointly hosted with the Genesee RiverWatch and will feature a discussion on the status of the Lower Genesee River Corrective Action, the DEC Environmental Response Trust. And so with that, before I do introductions, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to say a few words from Genesee RiverWatch.
Hi, I'm Mike Haw. I'm the president of the board of Genesee RiverWatch, and we've been talking to Lisa for some time about potentially getting this up and co-hosting it. A number of followers of ours and members of our board have seen what was done in the river this summer, and many people have asked us about what is going on. So I, along with them, are very interested in hearing the details of what was done this summer and what's to be done yet. So welcome to those of you who came through the portal of Genesee RiverWatch.
Great. Yes, welcome everyone. So today you will be hearing from three presenters, Lisa Gorton, Amy Ruda, and Bill Long. So Lisa is a PE and a project manager under DEC's Division of Environmental Remediation, a New York State professional engineer, and a graduate of Clarkson University in civil environmental engineering. Lisa has 26 years of combined technical, construction, and regulatory experience under large-scale state and federal Superfund programs. Lisa currently manages the design, permitting, and construction projects under New York State Superfund, including DEC's Environmental Response Trust associated with Kodak bankruptcy agreement to address the historical discharges to the Lower Genesee River. Amy Ruda is a senior technical specialist with Parsons Corporation, holds a BS in biology from the University of Wisconsin, a master's in environmental engineering from Illinois Institute of Technology, and a Juris Doctor from Syracuse University. With 8 years of progressive construction and technical experience, Amy served as the project engineer for an ENR Top 200 environmental contractor on several large-scale dredging and restoration projects, and is currently a member of Parsons technical staff supporting the design, permitting, and construction of the Lower Genesee River Corrective Action. Amy served as the primary technical liaison for the preparation of environmental permits for the Lower Genesee River. And last but not least is Bill Long, who is the senior project manager at Parsons Corporation. He has a BS in civil engineering from Clarkson University with 39 years of experience in large-scale state and environmental remediation projects. Bill served as the design and construction manager on the Lower Genesee Corrective Action. And with that, I will turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. And also thank you to both chapters of the AWMA and the RiverWatch for hosting us today. So I think if you boated or recreated on the Genesee River below the Memorial Bridge, you might recognize this title slide. It's the elevated walkway. It's a beautiful area, but it also served as a viewing point for one of our remediation areas that took place over the summer and fall. So what you may have seen are some floating platforms on the water with excavators mounted, either removing sediment into barges and or delivering clean fill into these areas. The project really is a culmination of a long-term study of the historical discharges to the riverbed stemming from legacy Eastman Kodak operations and primarily processed water predating the treatment processes that exist today along the riverfront. So the study area really covered, again, the river from the Memorial Bridge to the mouth of Lake Ontario. And it resulted in a RECRA corrective action statement of basis that was issued in 2020. So that the statement of basis really defined the areas in the river at risk of releasing materials or potential contaminants back into the environment, and primarily through either ecological exposure and or erosive forces, sediment transport. So this study, I'll note, really in the dredging work and disposal work is a state lead action. In the DEC, it led that action under the Environmental Response Trust, and that was initially funded during the Kodak bankruptcy process in 2012 and 2013. So the trust was executed and established with the DEC in 2014. And under that trust, we manage this corrective action, the lower Genesee River. And we also manage pre-existing environmental issues, upland issues. And you can see on the right is a picture of a park section, but legacy corrective actions under RCRA, which include 5 upland DEC subsites, over 4 park sections and several hundred acres of the existing Kodak park. And we also manage site management, monitoring and maintenance of active groundwater pumping systems, and any change in use relative to new development. We employ our resources to assist in the review of those change in use. So aside from the Genesee River, it's a very busy and active site, and we've made a lot of progress this year and over the past since 2014. So just to drop back with a little more detail, the historical discharges that we are addressing really come from primarily process waters from operations dating back into the late 1800s. So our focus, it was primarily on metal, silver, halides, or solids resulting from these historical practices and carried in wastewater. And you'll see it on the right, King's Landing area is denoted in red, and the blue outlined areas are really the park sections I mentioned earlier. So from King's Landing is the primary source of discharge of the impacts that we were addressing. And just noting, as we worked through studies, we did look at parameters and contaminants of interest across the board, but our primary corrective action was focused on the silver. And there was a process to determine that was the primary contaminant of concern. And I just also wanted to note that currently King's Landing wastewater treatment plant is located with a permitted discharge. And that plant has been in operation since the late 50s under Kodak, transferred to Red, Rochester, upgraded in the 1970s under the Clean Water Act, and is also under a New York State Speedies discharge permit. So it's a monitored discharge at this point. So as we discussed earlier, this is a culmination of many studies. So dating from the trust inception in 2014, our partners, Parsons, have been on board as our technical consultant. And you can see from this timeline, they've really provided us with a seamless transition through the various phases of the corrective action process. So I won't go through all these phases, but each phase of work has a report and data associated with it and decision-making process that are all available for public review. So these reports, and we'll provide you with some more information on how you can find these reports for more information, and if you wish in the future after this presentation. But with that being said, during this process, we worked extensively with stakeholders, our primary stakeholders. We were under a memorandum of agreement with EPA, also working with our counterparts at DOH, with national resource trustees, which members of the DEC and US Fish and Wildlife are members of. We're consulting, on an iterative process through this time frame at key decision-making points to move the process forward. So, Parsons did facilitate that process for us, and it all culminated in issuance of our prime dredging contract in early 2021, April timeframe. the selected contractor, White Lake Dock and Dredge out of Michigan, was selected to perform the work. So they were the contractors on the water performing the work. They've done an excellent job for us. And I'm happy to report that we did reach a construction substantial completion here earlier in December. And I'll note that Amy is going to go through some of the permitting stakeholders that were involved in the process, because that was a key integral part of getting us into the water, the permitting piece. So just from a regional overview on this slide on the left, the lower Genesee River, which flows from, I assume most of the participants know, flows from south to north, and it's part of the Rochester Embayment Area of Concern under the Great Lakes Program. So that's an EPA DEC joint led program to address areas of concern in the Great Lakes. And on the right, you'll see a green line, and that denotes our study area. So as under our program, we studied, it was just south of the Memorial Bridge, extending all the way north to the Lake Ontario. So just to expand on that, you know, this is our study area, and the message and point here with this presentation and visual is that we addressed an expansive area, over 100 acres of riverbed, 120 acres of wetland, and 5 distinct wetland areas, and also nearly 60 acres of floodplain. So the study area over several years encompassed this entire area. And I'm going to advance into the next slide. And these areas are the corrective action areas that were selected for remediation. And many have asked me along the way, how do you get from point A to point B and select these areas? Well, multiple lines of evidence and data were evaluated and applied through the process. So the focus areas, we found silver to be the primary contaminant of concern. There were areas that might be subject to erosive forces under flooding or high flow conditions that may release those impacted sediments back into the environment. And we also focused on the availability to the ecological receptors in the area. So this is an example of some of the studies that were conducted, and this is just a snapshot, not all inclusive, but many, many studies went into this, and all the studies resulted in data that were used to develop multiple lines of evidence. And the data really led us to these red areas where we felt we could add the best value and balancing criteria to address any future impacts. And again, focusing these studies in the wetlands as well. You can see some photos of the investigative work that was done in the wetlands. And I'll just, in this arena, you know, we had fish and wildlife impact analysis reports were prepared. They were prepared by Ramble under sub-consultant to Parsons at the time. And these were extremely useful in us defining areas where we may see or have ecological risk back into the environment resulting from contaminants of concern. So, and I've already touched upon some of this, but silver was selected as a primary contaminant of concern for both river and wetland sediment and soils. And it again was focused on some primary scour zones, and by scour, we mean areas that might be subject to erosion and release of contaminant under high flow conditions. And again, back to remedy selection, we worked closely with DOH and studied impacts to the silver. And silver was not identified as a contaminant of concern related to human health. And this was under a passive recreation use standard. And resulting in that, our selection of the remedy really focused on ecological exposure. So as we transitioned into that phase of the project, we really saw that generally the river system is very robust and healthy. You can see by the pictures on the right, fish and mussel community is robust. But we also, the data really led us to a point to support that some corrective actions were warranted on a localized level, that there were potential impacts in mussel and forage fish at these particular locations that may have been exposed to some higher concentrations of silver. So with that being said, these are the corrective action objectives that were developed for the program. I won't go through all of these bullet by bullet. And which led us to the considerations for the development of this selected remedy, which really overall was to reduce and stabilize areas with the potential for transport of silver containing sediments. We evaluated action levels, sediment guidance values were evaluated and screened, and we developed many river alternatives and wetland alternatives in the corrective measures study. They were developed separately and reviewed before the remedy was selected as part of the corrective measures action process. So the selective corrective action and construction elements that were implemented this past summer included dredging, which is 20,000 yards of river-based removal, 8,000 cubic yards of wetland sea removal, and also some isolated capping in river channel areas, backfill in wetland areas, and all the backfill that was placed meant an ecological use standard. For those of you that are familiar with the regulations, that was a Part 375 ecological use standard. In restoration, really, we along the way, we worked to add some enhancements to the wetlands to promote some topographical variability and plant diversity in the wetland, and also to support some upland restoration where our project support facilities disturbed upland areas. We tried to limit disturbance, and those areas are in the process of being restored at this time, and that may continue into the spring as well. So and from a long-term standpoint, we'll be implementing a long-term monitoring program for the project. So for our next steps here, we'll be issuing a final completion report, and those monitoring reports will become available as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, who's going to get really into the good stuff, the construction progress, and some photos of our work over the summer months. And Bill, you're up. You might be on mute,
Hey,
Bill.
Bill, I think,
There we go.
Perfect.
Got it. As Lisa pointed out on the previous slide, there's 28,000 cubic yards of dredging. In addition to that, to restore the areas, there was about 28,000 cubic yards of capping and backfill material, so an equal quantity. So a total of about 56,000 yards of material to move into and out of the river. So the question became, where are we going to be able to do that? The river is flat at the mouth by Lake Ontario at the north end, but most of that area is marinas and parks, very limited open space to move that kind of material through there. We had conducted most of the investigations on the river through the Shumway Marine up at the north end of the river. But that was small boats. That was typically like pontoon boats. As you go south on the river, going upstream, the river becomes less and less accessible due to wetlands, and a gorge starts to become very deep, very incised. There's the walkway at Turning Point Basin, and then it gets very steep, very limited access, no roads down to that point. There was one point at King's Landing. It's adjacent to one of the work areas, AOC 1, River Area 1, adjacent to King's Landing off of Maplewood Road that we decided to use. So we selected the staging area on the lower right corner of the figure. You can see where the staging area is located, right by King's Landing. It's also adjacent to the river area, one of the river areas. But there's 3 work areas, 2 in the river area 1 and 2, and wetland C. And pretty good distance apart. It's 1.5 miles from the staging area, King's Landing, to river area 2, and an additional ½ mile. So full 2 miles distance between it. The work areas you can see are defined by the different colors, the green, the orange, and the purple. Wetland C on the left, which is purple, has 2 separate areas, one of which is disconnected from the river. It's not adjacent to the river. So we had to go across the wetland to get that area to do that. The work elements that we had to do is we're going to have all of the material moving back and forth on the river in barges, both the dredge and the cap material, taken to the staging area where it would be offloaded or loaded, processed, and eventually disposed of. And any water that came from the dredging, which could potentially be contaminated, to be treated, and then discharged to King's Landing treatment plant, which was pretty advantageous because we didn't have to haul it any distance. We could simply pump it to the adjacent treatment plant. So what do we have to build at King's Landing? It's off Maplewood Drive. It's in the gorge. Probably drops about 150, 200 feet into the gorge at that point, along a steep access road. We found there was about 2 acres usable. It's a long, skinny area, but it's fairly close to the river level, only about 15 feet above the actual water elevation. So pretty good access. And we didn't have to cut a lot of trees to do a lot of grading to make that happen. We'd have to build the temporary dock and loading platform at the water's edge. You can see that at the top right of the corner of the picture. We'd built some processing pads for the sediment, because the sediment obviously would be too wet to truck off site. And then we had a temporary water treatment plant on site as well to take care of whatever water came off the sediment, and then the haul road to the plants. So you can see the red line is from the dock down into the plant, then a kind of a windy road up to the top. But it was a small area, but we anticipated big enough to be able to do the work. This is actual photos of the area construction, and we're pretty fortunate. A lot of these photos are actually drone photos. The contractor had a drone, which really gave us some very advantageous photos. First photo on the top left is a temporary dock built out of sheet pile with stone and wooden mats to fill it in. The river bottom, that area is fairly steep, so it gave us quick access to deeper water for the barges. Photo in the lower left corner is the actual dock, just about done being completed. That's where the barges were loaded and offloaded. Anything that was offloaded was taken into the truck and then hauled up the haul road, which is that skinny line between the trees, to the processing pad. Top right, back one. The top right corner is the sediment processing pad. It's got 2 sections that would hold about 800 cubic yards each. It was lined with a HDPE, a polyethylene liner, and some cement so that it would actually retain any water that came off the sediment, so we could treat it and send it to the treatment plant. And the bottom right picture there is the actual completed processing pad. That's that long skinny item. The blue area is tanks, the water treatment tanks. And that there was a treatment pad built for the water treatment plant as well that also would contain any water in case there was any leakage. All right, the dredging. We had 2 areas of in-water dredging. We anticipated 28 inches, and we allowed for 6 inches of over dredging, mainly because it's very hard to control underwater dredging to exact tolerances. And it was about 20,000 yards there. Wetland C was 26 inches. We allowed for 6 inches of over dredging. That's because the surface of the wetland is very soft and it would not support heavy equipment very well. And in Wetland C, we actually had to excavate into some of the areas because particularly the area that was not at the river's edge. And I'll show in a couple of slides the Lake Ontario elevations and how that actually affected the work. And also in that area to be able to dredge in, we were able to translate into some wetland enhancements for variable topography. We had some restrictions on when we could do the work due to fish spawning in both the fall and the spring. In the wetlands, we were allowed to work from June 1st to October 31st, about 5 months. In the river, from July 1st to October 31st, 4 months. but that's a little bit difficult because most of the material, about 70%, was coming out of the wetlands with a 1 month shorter duration. Fortunately, we were able to have no restrictions on the dock construction, so we get that ready ahead of time. And we'd have to have turbidity controls and monitoring so we did not affect the river quality. These are some shots of the actual dredging. You can see it's a barge mounted excavator. It had about a 70-foot reach, and it would only required about 22 inches of water to be able to work. The barges or the scows where the materials were put into would carry about 80 yards each. They would draft about 10 inches empty, but about 5 foot when full. So you can see the importance of having water depth in order to do the work. Those barges would be tied off to the excavator barge and then loaded up as they were taken care of. Most of the work areas were adjacent to shore. You can see there's some pretty, right along the edges of the wetland, some nice neat excavation. And you can see, particularly in the bottom right corner, the turbidity controls, the silt curtains that went around the work area. That would be moved up and with the equipment as it moved. We'd measured turbidity both upstream and downstream to make sure there were no increases in turbidity of the river. But you can see in the top left corner, the color of the river. It's pretty chocolate. So the turbidity is pretty dark. It's just normally from the flows in the river. Lake Ontario water elevations. This became important. Lake Ontario obviously is controlled by Messina up at the St. Lawrence River. To some extent, Mother Nature controls most of it though. And there's little difference between the actual lake and the river area, river work areas that we were in. 2017 and 2019, there was some flooding. You can see the peak flows up around elevation 249 or so. Typically the summer peak is about 247 foot. Wetland C lies at about 246. This year, actual elevation during the work, 245.4. So quite a bit lower. The barges wouldn't be able to float into Wetland C because of that elevation. So that's why we had to dredge some additional areas into it. And I would note that the river areas were not affected by any of the water depth. This is some photos of Wetland C. We actually excavated about 18,000 yards, not 8,000. So about 10,000 additional to get the varying topography for the wetlands. We actually did that by excavating 50-foot wide slots that the excavator and the barge could slide into and then work off of the edges. The NRD trustees had requested that topography for his wetland enhancements, and then they requested that we leave those slots deeper, that the final elevation would be less, so we had different water depth and get some different types of vegetation growing in there. I'll show more on that in a later slide. Top right corner, you can see we're dredging to minimize water. You can see where they left us a slice of land or sediment between the barge and where they're actually excavating. That allowed it to be able to get the material out as dry as possible. So we had less water to handle. And once they were able to no longer reach any further, then they would take that dam out, let it flood, and then move ahead. And interesting, in the bottom right corner, you can see how close we were working to the McKeel Spirit that delivers cement to Lehigh. And that's about a 459-foot boat that comes in there and backs out. So pretty tight quarters. Once the sediment was excavated and loaded into barges, it had to be dewatered and solidified with Portland cement. Obviously too wet to be able to truck off site. The material was taken to Seneca Meadows in Waterloo as non-hazardous. And then the water was treated, as I said, and taken to King's Landing under a agreement with Red and Kodak. This is a picture of a truck being loaded. You can see there's plastic underneath the wheels. Contractor used that to contain spills, keep the road and tires clean. And if there was any spillage, they would clean that up and replace the plastic as needed to keep things clean. Sediment processing. These some pretty good photos in here. If you look at the bottom left photos, the offloading the barge, you see the material was loaded into a bucket. They would swing that bucket so it was always over the actual dock. It had a spill plate to collect anything, so that we could minimize any spills or drips that went back into the river. Top right corner, you can see the sediment treatment pads in process. See the two different sections. One section would be material that's already solidified, ready to be shipped off site. The other section will be material that's in process. And then the bottom right, you can see trucks being loaded again. You can see a mister in there blowing some water on things. And that was a mister to control cement dust. Obviously, the wet sediment wouldn't create any problems, but cement dust is pretty caustic, so we had to use the mister for that. You can see some of the quantities. We used 2,550 tons of cement. It's about 6% by weight. 46,000 tons, 1,300 truckloads that had to run through the site, and discharged 272,000 gallons of water to the treatment plant. Once we were done, those areas had to be capped or backfilled and restored. AOC 1 and 2, the river areas. We had some capping in front of King's Landing, a multi-layer cap made of sand and stone. Wetland C had sand and topsoil in the areas that were not going to be an access channel, not that would return to the original excavation depth. And backfill was sand in just the channels, and then restored with a variety of wetland seeds and plants. The backfill material was obtained from relatively local quarries, Sodas, Webster, and Phelps. And then we had to restore the staging area once all of this was done back to the pre-existing conditions. And then the capping and backfilling process, we also had those spring and fall fish spawning restrictions as we did with dredging, and same thing with turbidity controls. River scour. This was kind of important. This is some interesting pictures in here. This was for the cap design. Mount Morris Dam, 67 miles upstream, completed in 1952. That dam has actually limited the number of ice jams that occurred downstream since it was built. So whatever ice jams have occurred have been relatively minor. You see a kind of interesting picture in 1920, a big ice jam at Broad Street Bridge, and then a smaller one at the O'Rourke Bridge. But the river is actually fairly wide versus the flow, so it limits the scour for potential damage. And the marinas have told us that their docks typically last for decades. They don't get a lot of ice damage. So it was determined based on that study that we needed about 4-inch diameter stone would be sufficient to protect the capping areas from any scour or ice flows. This is a quick schematic of what the in-river cap design actually looked like. We had 2 layers: a chemical isolation layer on bottom, which was made of sand, 3/4 inch or smaller, 12 inches thick minimum, and then an erosion protection habitat layer, which is the 4-inch stone to prevent scour on top of it. It was approximately same thickness as the dredging, 28 inches, plus that 6 inches of over dredge, so somewhere in the range of 28 to 34 inches. And all those materials that were put in there were tested for contaminants against the ecological standards, as Lisa mentioned earlier. Backfill C was similar, 2 layers, sand and topsoil, again, 12 inches thick for each layer, sand on the bottom, topsoil on top. Topsoil was only required in the areas that were going to be above grade, return to the original elevation. And the areas that were the channels were just sand. Again, the thicknesses were comparable, tested the material for contaminants, and like I said, based on the Lake Ontario elevations, the low water level is required dredging into that area in order to do the work. This gives a little better idea of what we meant by the different diversity in Wetland C that was requested by the NRD trustees. The pink areas are the actual access channels. They're about 50 foot wide, and we left them 4 feet deeper than the adjacent areas. The green area is the areas that were returned to the original elevation, about 246. And you see the adjacent navigation channel right there. So we ended up with kind of slots between it. And you'll see that. He's got a real good aerial photo in a couple of slides that'll show that, or the next one. So backfill and capping is basically the opposite of dredging, minus the processing and the materials, offsite disposal and water treatment. So basically just had to deliver, load the material into barges and then go place it in the river. Left-hand side is what backfilling in Wetland C occurring. The first slide on the top left is where it's starting. The bottom left is where it's actually close to completion. You can see the various elevations in there, so we have some different topography. Areas AOC 1, top right corner, you see that's immediately adjacent to a wetland. And then bottom right is right in front of King's Landing. Real good view from shore on that one. So working blind, how do you control all this work if it's underwater and you can't see what you're doing? Well, the dredge operator has a dredge program. It is a GPS that gives him both vertical and horizontal control. So basically the operator watches the screen like a video game, and during both dredging and capping. And that picture on the left is a actual picture right off of the screen, what he's got. You can see the excavator bucket on the top, gives him his vertical, the bottom one's his horizontal positioning. And then as well, try to check excavation or capping depths. We could check sand layer with Lexane tubes, in addition to any checks that we have a survey. So you can see they're measuring, you see the difference in the materials at about 17 inches at that particular location in Wetland C. Quality control for surveying. We had 3 types of surveying methods being used. You had the survey boat using sonar. Also had an echo boat, which was for shallow water. It was a remote control boat, basically working with a joystick. It would record that. And then once you get into real shallow water where neither boat can access, the guys actually did pole shots. It's kind of a humorous picture on the right. The guys come up with a pretty inventive footwear method. He's got paint trays strapped to his feet so he wouldn't sink into the material. Quality control for turbidity. The work areas were surrounded by silt curtains, which is a floating curtain that has a weight on the bottom, so the top stays at the surface and the bottom goes deep into the water column to surround the area, basically contain it. You can see on the top right, we're working inside the curtain in all areas. That's a picture during capping. And we had monitoring turbidity, monitoring buoys to measure the turbidity. They were located 100 foot upstream and downstream. They were telemetry. They'd send the messages back to the work trailer, and we could compare the upstream to the downstream readings to make sure that there were no exceedances. And fortunately, through the work, we did not have any exceedances. Wetland C plantings. We had both emergent and submergent plants. Emergent would be the ones growing above elevation, and submergent below. Those you can see on the bottom right photo, you can see the differences in the submergent and the emergent zones. Those are in the process of revegetating. We actually are planting about 12,000 plants made up of 20 species. Additionally, using a seed mix with about 18 different wetland species. The work will be completed in 2020. Unfortunately, some of the seed mixes and plants were not available in 2021. Surprisingly, a pretty big demand for it. But you can see, we got a pretty good start on it in the areas, and it'll only get better next year when the growing season comes along. Restoration, the river bend areas, a couple of quick pictures here. Basically, you wouldn't even notice it. Bottom right picture is river area 2. You see a slight disturbance at the river edge. You wouldn't even know we're there for the most part. Bottom left is right next to King's Landing. And you can see that some of the stone is exposed. That'll vary depending upon the water elevation at the time, but that provides some good scour protection out in front of King's Landing. And then my last slide is the staging area restoration. All those temporary facilities have been removed. The dock, the access road, regraded, recreated a paving area if that was there to begin with. We've got topsoil and some seeding done and some erosion controls. We've got some work to do in 2022 to finish things up and clean it up. Obviously, we got done in late November, December, not the best time of year to see grass grow. So we've got erosion controls set up there with silt fence and socks and hay bales, and that'll remain until the grass is established sometime late next year.
Okay, so I'll take over from Bill from here. My name is Amy Ruda. I do the permitting for Parsons. So before we could do any of this work, we needed to permit this work. And permitting is always more complicated than most people think. So to start, what you kind of ask yourself is, where is the work going to occur? What does the work require? And is this a regulated activity? And who's going to be involved? So the first question of where is the work going to occur? Well, here we're going to be in the lower Genesee River. We're going to be in the coastal zone of Lake Ontario. We're going to be in wetlands. We're going to be in floodplains. And all of those things are relevant to who's going to get involved in this project from a permitting perspective. Now, what does the work require? Well, it's dredging, it's filling, it's tree removal, it's ground disturbance, among other things. And then is the activity regulated? So what does the work require? Applying that to where is the work going to occur kind of answers some of those questions, and also brings into what agencies will end up regulating these activities. And since my part is a little dry, I've provided some kind of pretty logos of, who are the potential agencies, what are the potential rules, who might get involved in some of these activities. And I've sprinkled my slide with that a little bit. So this is not exhaustive. There's many, many more where this came from, but this is kind of a high level of what do you have to start thinking about in order to get this job permitting. Now, moving to the next slide, the kind of first question is, who are my federal stakeholders? And here in particular, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they have jurisdiction over this project because we're in the lower Genesee River. So for the Corps, I had to secure a nationwide permit 38 under sections 401 and 404 of the Clean Water Act and section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act. And what the nationwide 38 allows, it allows the cleanup of hazardous waste and toxic waste when the cleanup is sponsored by a government agency with legal or regulatory authority. Now, to provide some context, this means the nationwide program basically allows the Corps to issue general permits to authorize activities that have minimal environmental impacts. And there are 58 different kinds of general permits that can be authorized, and they're for all different kinds of activities. So my particular nationwide 38 was relevant to this activity. However, there are many other activities that the Corps has jurisdiction over with their general permits. The general permits authorize activities for up to 5 years. And kind of a fun fact is that the nationwides on average authorize 35,000 reported activities per year and 30,000 unreported activities per year. And those aren't unreported as in someone's not doing something right. Those are unreported as in the nationwides don't require, the Corps doesn't require the reporting of those activities. They're just authorized to do them. So this happens a lot with the nationwides. So starting early with the Corps is a good thing because they have so many permits happening. So the other Corps consideration here is a section 408 authorization. And here the river contains a navigational channel managed by the Corps under the Civil Works program, which Bill had mentioned earlier about that big barge turning around. So Civil Works projects, there's such things as flood risk management and navigational improvements. So here we had a navigational improvement that the Corps had completed. Now, when a Civil Works project is altered or used by another party, the Corps has to approve that activity. So here we were subject to approval by the Corps because we were using the nationwide, or excuse me, the navigational channel. So that's kind of how the Corps is involved with this project. And we also were coordinating with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Fisheries and the National Marine Fisheries Service. And that's a mouthful. But under both of those agencies, we had to do what was called a Section 7 consultation. And what the Section 7 is that's a consultation to determine whether threatened or endangered species or critical habitats exist in the project area. And here, both agencies indicated that no threatened or endangered species or critical habitats existed in the project area. And further, NOAA indicated that our project site was outside of their jurisdictional area. So no further consultation was necessary with them. So that's on the federal level. So in the next slide, moving to the state level, we had several stakeholders involved as well. First was the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, Region 8. And for those of you who don't know, the DEC has multiple regions throughout the state of New York, as you can see on that figure on the right. And the Rochester area falls within the Region 8 area. So here with the region, we had to apply for a Section 401 water quality certification. And then we ultimately later did a permit modification. So we were issued a Section 401, and then later that permit modification, that was completed to accommodate NRD trustee coordinated enhancements in Wetland C that Bill had spoken about earlier. And that was, strictly wetland enhancements. Those enhancements were not part of our original permit application. So we then later had to go and apply for a change regarding that. For the New York State Department of State, we were within the realm of a coastal consistency review. And to provide context for this, what that means is a coastal consistency review ensures the protection of natural assets in New York State coastal areas and also in designated inland waterways. And that must be done in compliance with the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act. So it's a federal requirement that New York State within the Department of State completes. So the Department of State generally concurs that the majority of the Corps' nationwide permits are protective of coastal areas. But to ensure that, we provided this information to the Department of State so that they then reviewed our information on our project, what we were going to do, and then they issued a concurrence for the project since we were completing the project under Nationwide 38. There's also a local aspect to this where the activity has to conform to the local waterfront revitalization program. And that is a document that the city of Rochester developed and prepared that was provided to the Department of State. And so the Department of State reviewed our project under kind of all of these umbrellas. And as I said, Department of State did concur with our project. The New York Office of General Services, now they have jurisdiction over state-owned lands underwater and docks, moorings, and platforms installed over these state-owned lands. So basically the state-owned lands underwater means when you're building on, in, or over state-owned lands, here the riverbed, or if you're putting in docks, moorings, or platforms, that the the Office of General Services has to issue a permit for those activities. So here, we weren't installing any permanent structures. So Office of General Services indicated that there was no jurisdiction, and they said, we have no jurisdiction for this project. And we expected that, both for OGS and Department of State, we expected both those responses, but we always want to be told that instead of assume that. And then finally, turning to the New York Historic Preservation Office, which is that last bullet, among other things, because we had ground disturbance, we needed to comply with Section 106 of the Federal National Historic Preservation Act. And to do that, we completed a Phase 1 archaeological survey. We provided that information to the department, and then they reviewed our information, and then they issued a letter stating that there was no adverse effect on historic properties. And so that said, we don't have to do any more investigation. They've determined that we can go ahead with this activity. For a little background, again, this no adverse effect, this kind of includes and generally includes archaeological or historic resources that are listed in or eligible for the New York State and National Registers of Historic Places. So then turning to the local stakeholders, we provided informational distributions well ahead of time to both Monroe County and the city of Rochester. And what resulted from that is that the county indicated that they wouldn't require any permitting. And the city, they would require some permitting. Typically on projects where you're working within a river, the city would require such authorizations as a floodplain development permit, and that includes any activities within a regulated floodplain, pretty much anything. And they would also require an MS4 authorization for a stormwater pollution prevention plan. Now that means basically the city reviews our erosion control measures and authorizes us to work on, issues us a permit to work within how we said. So here the city indicated that it would defer to DEC since DEC was the lead agency for these particular authorizations. Since the project was state funded and it was a state funded construction project and it was required to meet the substantive requirements of these permits already, we weren't issued these permits necessarily, although we still had to do the things that the permits would have required. The kind of permitting that the city did require, it was really much more local. It was zoning and ordinance authorizations, such as a building permit when we installed the staging area, such as when you install a fence or so on, you have to get a building permit. And we also were required to obtain a traffic closure permit when we actually brought equipment into the site, if we had to cross a road or whatnot. So much more local type of permits. So moving to the next slide, you know, that's a lot of stakeholders. That's a lot of information. That's a lot of activity, a lot of regulated areas. So in order to keep this smooth and to keep our construction on target, we held a major stakeholder pre-application meeting. We held that in March of 2020. That was a year ahead of construction. So I think here, you know, the major take home is that plan well ahead of time. In order to keep things on target. Now, this meeting was attended by the Corps and the DEC Region 8 permitting and ecological staff. And what it introduces is an overview of the project, the proposed work, and the anticipated means and methods of the project. We establish a document sharing site, and then we kind of have an open discussion. And here, some issues that came up during the open discussion was an active lake sturgeon restoration effort that was going on locally. Keeping our access to river for anglers open, and that we were to conduct a native freshwater mussel survey and salvage for mussels living within our project area. And so then moving to the actual permit itself on the next slide. And I'm not going to read this, but this is an example of the kind of deliverables that go into this permit. It's a tried and true approach to kind of a large, complicated project. And it's very simple in theory. It's providing a cover letter showing a roadmap to what I'm going to give them. And then it's a bunch of attachments to the cover letter. And just to note, this is really simplifying this, but if offhand, I believe that this permit submittal was upwards of maybe 500 pages. So it's a substantial document. And then moving on finally for permitting to project closeout considerations. Our nationwide permit authorization that expires in March 2022, and the Corps does not issue extensions. Now this is relevant because, as Bill discussed, there are some final touches that are going to occur in the summer, the planting of some of these wetland plants. But this is really no issue because under the nationwide permit program, permittees can continue work for 12 months after the expiration date, as long as the work is under construction or under contract, which we are. And you don't need to let the Corps know that you are going to continue this work. And just to note, this isn't special to us. This is universal for all expiring nationwides, unless when you get your original authorization, you're told you can't do this. And just to note, this expiration, this is of those 58 nationwide permits, a good chunk of them are expiring in March, and they are going to be reissued by the Corps. So again, this isn't specific to our project, but it is kind of an interesting, side note. So that's the permitting aspect of the project. And to provide more information, we've provided project and contact information for the Genesee River project. And it's my pleasure to thank you all for attending. We really hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And I would now like to cede the floor to our audience for any questions, any comments, any so on and so forth, because we love to talk about our project.
So everyone should be able to unmute yourself and ask all of your questions. Just ask that you one person at a time, please. And if you're having issues unmuting yourself, feel free to type your questions in the chat.
Hey, Melissa, I think everyone's overwhelmed because there was just such a great presentation.
Hi,
I have a question.
Very good presentation. Is there anything you would have done differently or any challenges that you faced that maybe could have been avoided?
I can take this, I guess there's no one size fits all for a project like this. And I think that in hindsight, there really, I think we probably even could have started some of the permitting process even earlier, but under our project constraints and to ensure that all our stakeholders had input on our decision making, we were pigeonholed into a compressed time frame. So relative to sediment projects, the timeline that we did show is compressed. So we were running a lot of parallel activities at one time. Design was overlapping with permitting, and as design changes were made, permitting modifications were updated and informational submittals were updated. So if you had the time, I would strongly recommend that you develop, at least in concept, your design, maybe, and allow a little more time for that permitting piece. It worked for us in the long run. But it was a very extensive project with coordination with all the various stakeholders because, during that time, we were making changes. We were trying to keep all the stakeholders engaged in what that meant for their particular interests. And again, as Bill and Amy alluded to, it was a constant triage of those that were interested in maintaining that communication.
And we have a whole bunch of questions that are popping up as we go. So I can, for one of them, for Kara, was most of your communications to agencies regarding permitting complete by your March 2020 meeting? That was a big no. The communications to and with agencies realistically was an ongoing effort that was not only the length of, not only prior to March 2022, or excuse me, prior to March 2020, but it continued after March 2020. It continued up to construction, during construction. So there was a lot of communication. I don't think there was any real stop and start to the communication, to be honest. And then we've got another one, I think, for Lisa and Bill. Was there any thought to dewatering the sludge with polymer rather than cement? And
yes, I can answer that one. No, we did a treatability study that included a number of polymers as well as Portland cement. And Portland cement turned out to be the most economical and easiest to obtain. We did leave it up to the contractor to submit alternates if they chose, but they did not. They went with Portland cement.
so we've got another question that is, do you have a sense of how much silver was recovered? And then a sub question or another question of where did the dredging go, which I assume where did the disposal go? I imagine that question means.
Yeah, that was the dredging material. Dredge materials went to Seneca Meadows in Waterloo, New York. And the total quantity of silver, Lisa, I don't.
We haven't done a mass recovery calculation on what was removed, and that that's the silver concentration, the action level for some of our decision making was established at 70 part per million silver. Which is, for those of you that are familiar with the sediment screening guidances, is considerably higher than the guidance value. However, that value wasn't selected, out of the thin air. As I alluded to early in the presentation, there were several lines of evidence, including benthic community assessments, toxicity testing, and other data points that really led us to that point, that action level point. So
there's a question there. What was the action level for turbidity And was turbidity monitoring required during the cap material placement? Yes, turbidity monitoring was required during both dredging and capping. The action level was 50 NTUs, nephelometric turbidity units of 50 above background. The 50, yes, 50 above background. We had a warning level of 25 above background in case, just to make sure that if something was increasing, that we had a chance to correct it before we had an exceedance.
I've
I
got
think
one.
there was a question about speaking about the ongoing monitoring at the site.
I can address that. So I think, you know, under our program, after construction completion within a year, we're required to have an operations and maintenance plan in place for monitoring, continued monitoring. So that will, you know, we'll continue to monitor quantitative, qualitative measures of the remedy, inspection of the cap areas to ensure that the integrity is maintained. And that will occur on an annual basis for a minimum of at least the first 5 years. And then ongoing after that. At 5 year, we'll reevaluate the performance. And if any additional measures are recommended, we would make those changes or recommendations at that time. So I'm reading one here that came in. How much did Kodak pay to fund this? So I'll just I'll clarify that Kodak established the trust fund that is managed. The fiduciary responsibility for that trust is managed through the DEC. So the overall construction management and design costs were, you know, close to, you know, $16 million on this effort. So a substantial cost that has been managed over, you know, many years.
I have a
Anything-
question.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mary Ann Rizzo. I live in Rush, New York. Our town is on the Genesee River, and we have a group called the Rush Recreation and Park Association. And we are, you know, beginning to take it seriously that we are part of the solution. But so I wanted to thank you for your effort, all your hard work. It's honorable, it's amazing, and it's inspirational. I know you mentioned silver as being the major contaminant that you were working on, but I assume that you've done levels for other contaminants. And I just wonder, I know you were talking about monitoring. I just wondered, you know, the pre and the post conditions and maybe what your expectation might have been. And it sounds like the project's not over with yet, but at some point it would be nice to know, like, what do you feel the project actually, you know, accomplished? I'm sure it did accomplish a lot.
Well, you know, I'll start with your first question. Yes, we did screen a full suite of contaminants of concern, both organic and inorganic contaminants. That includes metals, PCBs, PAHs, and that's a lot of technical talk, but we did screen. So the corrective measure and RFI process provides screening of all those contaminants, and really through an iterative process of reviewing those against our guidance and screening and regulation values, eliminates those to a short list. And that short list then again is compared against those contaminants that may have been attributable to Kodak's historical discharge. So, you know, the data is available and summarized nicely in some of these reports. So they're quite large reports, but they are available. So that was an iterative process, but we did look at everything along the way. And then secondly, regarding post-monitoring efforts, you know, our overall goal, there are a lot of stakeholders in the river, from regional and federal stakeholders. that have made great improvements on the waterway. So our goal was just to enhance those improvements that have been already made and the progressiveness that's been applied in some of those programs across the board, and continue to provide support where we can to monitor the improvement and enhancements along the way. So I think our main goal is to protect our completed work. So the work that we've done, we want to ensure that it remains intact, and the integrity of the caps are maintained, and that we're seeing vegetative growth in these wetland areas. But our work doesn't stop here. We continue to work with stakeholders as they reach out to us to enhance their efforts, the efforts that are in play there. So
Thank you very much.
you're welcome.
There was one more question on the chat. It says, is there any possibility that resuspension of sediments during events will lead to deposition and creation of new hotspots?
Yeah.
That likelihood is very, very low. We either removed the contaminant levels of concern or capped them. Most of this river area is depositional in nature. So that, they would tend to be buried deeper rather than less over time. And the amount of the weight of the stone we put on top of it should armor it pretty well so that there shouldn't be any issues.
And no media coverage is coming in. To my knowledge, there might have been some earlier media coverage on this when we first kicked off the project initially, and we did provide some outreach in the form of fact sheets and initially. So.
All right, well, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to ask them. We are a little bit over our time, but I think that's okay because this is a great presentation with lots of information. But if no one else has any questions, I'd like to just thank you all so much for your time today and this wonderful presentation, jam-packed, full of information. We have certificate of appreciations for all of you, which we will send to you along with a little speaker gift. This is just a screenshot of what they look like. They will be in paper form when they come to you. But so from AWMA, thank you. And Mike, if you have any last words, go ahead.
Well, I'd just like to thank all of you who presented. It's a wonderful presentation and certainly clarifies a lot of the potential questions that were asked by people on the river and beside the river this summer. I see quite a number of people with associations with RiverWatch on the call today, so thank you all for coming as well.
Hey, you're welcome. That's actually a very beautiful stretch of the river. It's surprising the number of deer and fox and bald eagles and wildlife that are seen in that gorge during the work is pretty amazing.
There aren't many cities that can lay claim to what we have called a wilderness within the city.
I agree. It's a beautiful area, and I've enjoyed spending time in the area, and we'll continue to move these projects forward. But thank you again for inviting us and the opportunity.
All right, great. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Thanks.
Happy holidays.
Bye.
Thank you all.